Hi, Zaina. Can you hear me?
Hello? Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, boy, that was confusing because when I was at the training session, they told me I was in the StreamYard. And I asked them, I was like, okay. And then I got a link this morning that said, here's the StreamYard link to your session. And then now I got the link to that. So I was like, wait a minute. Like, what? So anyway, good.
Yeah, it always happens. But I think
Yeah, no worries.
all good now. How are you doing?
Good, good. How are you?
Yeah, all good, thank you. Very quiet.
Awesome.
I'm still at work, so everyone's left, so just me now.
Awesome. Let me see if I can turn on another light, maybe get it a little brighter in here. That's okay. Sorry. I actually don't use this office very much, so I have no idea how the lights work. We are going to find out. Oh, there we go. Okay, well, I guess that's it. That's as good as it gets there.
No, I think that's all right. I think that's good enough.
Is that all right here, or is that too industrial looking?
No, we've got some books in the background.
Yeah, I did it on purpose. So
Okay. I think we're going to start in a couple of minutes, but I think there's already people in the room, if I'm correct.
Amazing.
And we're already recording. Okay. Yeah. Give it a couple more minutes.
Sure.
Yeah.
I forgot again. How long are we speaking in? I forgot.
1 hour.
Okay, perfect.
Leave the
No
last
worries.
20 minutes for some questions. So
Awesome.
I'm sure you have plenty to say.
Great.
Okay, so it's 4:30. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session for the Palestine Digital Activism Forum 2022. Why free knowledge is a human right and how Wikipedia is advancing human rights and access to knowledge. So today we're here with Kamran Ashraf, who is head of the human rights at the Wikimedia Foundation. He's an assistant professor at the School of Public Policy, Central European University, and he is co-founder of the International Human Rights and Technology Organization Access Now. And we're very happy to have him. And I'm Zaina Al Haroon, and I'll be moderating this workshop today. So today we'll be talking about how Wikipedia, as an open and free website, is important for digital activism and solidarity. There'll be space for questions from activists and content creators to talk about how Wikipedia, they could publish and modify content on Wikipedia. And also we have Kamran today who can kind of shed light on how we can do this and what are the important and the most pivotal policies for content creators in Palestine and beyond in the present situation. So I think we can start off with, we've all heard about social media and how important it is for activists in telling their own story, in showing the world their own narrative. And it's been particularly pivotal in Palestine. The past few years, we had the hashtag Save Sheikh Jarrah movement, in which the whole world, people all around the world, were tweeting about this tiny street in a tiny East Jerusalem neighborhood. And they were telling their story directly to the world. So we know that Instagram, Facebook, Twitter is a tool for digital rights, is a tool for people to tell their own narratives. But people don't often associate Wikipedia with human rights, which is why we have Cameron here today to kind of tell us what the association is with that. Could you maybe give us a bit of background about how it could be used as a tool for digital activism and solidarity?
Awesome, Zaina. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And it's really nice to be here with everybody. Hopefully you can hear me well and see me well. So one of the most interesting things about Wikipedia, I think, is, whenever you go to your social media account, whatever it is, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, you always see something different than what other people see, right? Zaina's feed is not the same as my feed, for example. But when you go to Wikipedia, you actually see, everybody sees the same thing. You go to, if Zaina and I go to the Arabic language Wikipedia, article on Palestine, we both see the article on Palestine, which makes Wikipedia really unique in the sort of social media space, right? Because it's one of the few places on the internet where we can come together around the same thing and not be so fragmented and subject to algorithmic, things that happen with algorithms that we're not entirely sure of. So I think right off the bat, that's really one of the very important parts of Wikipedia for activism in general, is because it is one of the few places on the internet where we can come together around common narratives and we can shape narratives. Journalists use Wikipedia for their background research. Academics use it, for teaching, even though they may not admit it, but they use it for, teaching in their classes, and students use it, of course, to learn tons of things, which I always find very interesting and exciting. It's that fact that because it is the space that we hold in common, and then be a space that really informs so many narratives. I mean, we've all been to dinner, we've had a question about something, we look it up, we look at the first few sentences of Wikipedia, we move on our phones, and so that, can give you a sense of how, the narratives that are on Wikipedia can really inform what activists even know about, what, things they're passionate about, how they see the world. And I'll give you an example. So I was teaching a class at UCLA, and it was a laboratory class, and I was sitting there, and there was a student, and the students were having to do an activity, and there was a student sitting next to me, and all of a sudden, a Chinese student, he started to cry. He was just crying, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, are you okay? Is everything all right?" And up on his screen was the Wikipedia article on the Tiananmen Square massacre. He was an exchange student, and he said he never knew that this had happened. And he was sitting there crying for the first time he was exposed to what the massacre that happened there. And so to me, that gives you an example of the power of Wikipedia, really to help expose us to new ways of learning and being, especially with its, crossing language barriers. It can really open up a space for activism that is also less ephemeral than social media, right? Once once the event passes on Twitter or Instagram, it's gone. Next thing's on your feed. The article on Wikipedia stays. If you see, so hopefully that kind of addresses the bigger concept of why this is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned something interesting there, that we could look at an article in Arabic. Even though Wikipedia is advertised as a multilingual online encyclopedia, most people associate it with English. Do we have it in all the different languages? What's the content like? Is it better in English? What could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that's it. That gets to me, to quite a lot of different narratives. First is the tendency that in many countries in the world, especially I'm half Iranian in the Middle East, to look at English as sort of that's the real language, that's the language of record, if you will. And so it first of all calls us to interrogate, why do we put so much weight on English Wikipedia? It's the biggest one, sure. And there's conversations there that are important, but I often wonder about, where is the, from the Iranian perspective, are Iranian Wikipedians reading or looking at, trying to read Arabic Wikipedia, or vice versa, or whatever sort of these national groups, national language groups are out there. So I think, first we have to interrogate, the primacy we put on English as a language, that this is really something quite, important, simply because it's, in a way, a global lingua franca, excuse me. So that's the first thing that come up when people put such a heavy weight on English Wikipedia. But there are issues. For example, English Wikipedia gets the most views, and the editors who are doing English Wikipedia, unless they're bilingual, are not necessarily reading Arabic Wikipedia. So each language community operates independently. So the Arabic-speaking community, they edit Arabic Wikipedia, and some of them perhaps are in dialogue with English Wikipedia, but I'm willing to bet most aren't. So we can get quite a different type of a coverage there. Coverage of events in Palestine, for example, on English Wikipedia, which gets so many readers, might be significantly different from the coverage in Arabic. And that gap is actually, translation is activism, right? Where we have bilingual individuals, who can speak both Arabic and English, who can then translate these relevant articles, help facilitate, English Wikipedia, despite the issues I mentioned earlier from the sort of English as a sort of, language that we consider such an important language, but, translating those articles and ensuring there's a sort of a cross-linguistic dialogue going on between these two Wikipedias. And I find that an important source of activism and something that people can really get involved in to address that language gap. And there are, of course, again, like I said, other issues that have to do with why are we appealing so much to English Wikipedia. But that's a separate topic.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll definitely cover that as well in this session, because it's really an interesting topic. I mean, to talk about how, why, in your view, I mean, as a Palestinian myself, I'm a British Palestinian. There are so many different people telling different narratives about my own history, for example. So that would definitely be a big motivating factor for me to get on to Wikipedia and to start recording some of that history, because this is obviously my opinion, but I feel our history is often coming under attack in many different ways, from many different angles, people telling different narratives. So how would you feel Wikipedia would help Palestinians, for example, in that sense?
Right, you touched upon a brilliant point, and I'll just respond to Mohammed in the chat very quickly there. Absolutely brilliant point, right? You have a sense, as least from what I understand that you've shared, that your history is not your own, and it's so subject to other winds, right? And how many smaller countries or groups have been subject to forced relocation and dislocation. Their history is really taken over and subjected to other dominant perspectives, right? This is where where I was kind of going with the English Wikipedia as being so dominant. The individuals who edit it have a particular perspective and bias, right? So and Arabic Wikipedia, of course, has its own bias. It's not saying that it's going to give a totally neutral perspective. And so like what you're saying, is when Palestinian voices, for example, on Palestinian history, can edit Wikipedia, that they can take ownership of the history. It's something I have seen with Farsi Wikipedia with Afghanistan, right? When we see Afghans actually have taken control of their own historical narrative, particularly on the role of women, for example, excluded from history, but then there was a sense of Afghan women and men editing Wikipedia and being able to discuss their own history and take an ownership for it, rather than sort of the narrative from the West that that the women are oppressed and haven't done anything. That may the oppression is a separate topic, but the narrative could be challenged by these sort of authentic local real voices, and that's where for Palestinians, I think it's essential to both edit Arabic Wikipedia and ensure that history is recorded, and also, if they can, to try to help cross that gap into all the other languages of Wikipedia, whatever languages or friends to create that cross-fertilization, to broaden the narrative from authentic sources, because the sources in English Wikipedia are going to be English language sources, which, as you know, I'm also bilingual. There's a English and Arabic or Farsi. There's a lot lost in translation there, and being able to cross that gap, I think, is really, really important, to take ownership of the history, and to actually be sure as much as possible that whatever may happen in dominant global media, at least in Arabic, your voices aren't being erased, if you see what I mean. So at least there's a space where it's not being erased. And I think at minimum, that's really essential, especially as we see, the way the history is being erased, literally on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on something interesting. You're talking about editors, and I think that a lot of people don't actually know the process of editing content or uploading content. Could you explain to us a bit more about how you could do that, if it's different in each language, if there's anyone working on translations, or if there's any access in that sense?
Yeah, so the way Wikipedia is very interesting because it's not organized around national borders, right? It may be some correlation, but it's, for example, Hungarian Wikipedia is going to be mostly focused on the country of Hungary. But it's organized around language groups, which is really, really empowering, because that, if you're in the diaspora as well, you definitely have a diasporic background as I do. If a country-based focus can exclude the diaspora, who have their own take on national history and culture, right? A very as authentic, as valid as people who are located in the country. So Wikipedia is organized, on this linguistic basis, which invites people around the world, to contribute to their language focus, which is, extremely important. So, and you can edit across different languages. So, for example, if you speak English and Arabic, you have one Wikipedia account. You can do edits in English. You can do edits in Arabic, and you can do those translations and cite back. And it's a participatory platform. So that means, you join it and you can become more involved in, first of all, editing things you're interested in and knowledgeable about, but then getting involved in the governance, actually, of your language Wikipedia. This is something that genuinely surprised me, was how truly, really democratic Wikipedia can be, and is in many regards, because when you read Arabic Wikipedia, you're not seeing the Wikimedia Foundation's opinion of knowledge. You're actually seeing what the community has determined is knowledge. So editing can also take you beyond just sort of, making simple edits on, some topic you're interested in, but then actually being involved in how does this entire online encyclopedia grow. And you can rise through the ranks based on, your work that you do with the community, the edits that you do, how well you interact with the community, to have significant levels of oversight over the direction of that language encyclopedia in a very democratic way. So all it takes is, starting to sign up. And, I made an account. I was very intimidated in the beginning because it seems like a lot, but then I started with, you can start as something as simple as I was editing typos or minor mistakes, for things that I knew, very minor ones, nothing, even though I have a PhD and all that stuff, but I still didn't feel comfortable doing it. But you can even start very simple and then work your way up and interact with the community in that way.
That's great. You mentioned that the Arabic Wikipedia, and we've had a chat about this before, just to kind of emphasize how Wikipedia isn't just solely an English site. I think you have a statistic about how many visitors it has for the Arabic pages.
Yeah, if you give me a moment, it's quite remarkable how much the Arabic Wikipedia statistics. I've got it actually just right here. So the total page views last month in April, 277 million page views on 42 million unique devices, right? That's remarkable. That's, almost 300 million. And over the past 12 months, it's been 3 billion total page views.
Wow, 3 billion.
Can you believe it? Isn't that inspiring? That's inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. Me and Kamran had a chat before, and I actually told him how I couldn't speak Arabic, or I could speak Arabic, I couldn't read and write Arabic a couple of years ago. But the first thing that I did was look up the tiny remote village where my family is from. In English, no results. But in Arabic, I managed to see the village, and I managed to see the 6 main families who were in there. And there I could see my mother's maiden name. And that was so exciting for me, because growing up in the diaspora, growing up as a minority in Britain, I'd never seen my name or my family's name on these ancestry websites. So that was something that really, really appealed to me and made me think, oh, okay, where could I go further with this as I advance my language even more? So that's absolutely something that I'd encourage as well. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, if for 1 second, if that's all right, Zaina.
As long as you want, please.
When I know when I've done this sort of ancestry thing, and my American side, easy to go back and find stuff, but my Iranian side, it stops quite early. And I of course looked at the hometown that my family is from in Iran, and I couldn't find much. But one of the projects I'm excited to take is to do with regards to that is there is a I forget right now, I don't have the top of my head, but I have a bookmarked university library that's got in the United States, historical maps of Fars province, which is a province my family is from. And one of my plans that I like to do is actually contact the university library and see if I can get scans of that, since I do have an academic affiliation as well, and then upload those to Wikimedia Commons so that there's more representation and more maps for people who might have family from that province. Exactly. So there's even these sort of self-driven projects that we can do to also add the content that might be missing for people curious, about these things.
Exactly. It's something that many people, I'm sure, found really exciting, especially having so little information, in our hands. We're having quite a few questions come in. We were going to do questions at the end, but I think it might be good to just do them throughout because they're relevant to the things that we're chatting about. So we have a few from Vanna, who says, are there ways in which Wikipedia editors can use that experience in their professional life? And she says, there are various Wikipedia pages that are impossible to edit for beginners. It feels less attractive to edit the history of popcorn as opposed to the history of Jerusalem. How can it be more attractive for editors?
Yeah, so I can address the first question, then we'll go on to the second in just a moment. So the first one about, if using Wikipedia editors can use the experience in professional life. So this is where the human rights side of things comes in a little bit. It can be dangerous in certain geographies, and of course we're speaking to the Arab world here, so I think most people can understand what I'm talking about. Using your real name, having your real name on Wikipedia tied to your real name offline, that can present certain problems, if you're editing, politically sensitive topics or other sensitive topics. That's important to keep in mind, is to be sure that, you're using a separate name. But absolutely, there are a lot of ways you can use your Wikipedia experience in professional life. Wikipedians love to come together in events and get together and do, edit-a-thons and work together. So first of all, there's a networking component, which it can be very exciting. Universities will often be quite keen on working on this, or student unit groups, graduate students or undergraduate student groups coming together. The research skills that it takes to do a really thorough job on a good Wikipedia article is itself quite gold. A lot of people, we're going to go into a working life, and that part of ourselves that really works, that academic side, can kind of get a little dry. And so doing this kind of work can actually kind of reignite the love of learning. So those skills can be quite are wonderful. And actually, we have a Wikipedia library where if you have enough edits, you can actually have access to academic journals. And that itself, that you would have to be part of a university or pay, enormous amounts of money to have access to. But we actually have that here if you have a certain number of edits and are active. So that can also benefit your professional life, because then you have access to academic resources, which you might not have otherwise. And then, finally, I could talk like about 7 hours about it, but finally, just the fact of editing, first of all, gets you more comfortable with, some aspects of, doing content management online, but also can make you more knowledgeable about topics you are curious about, like how, again, to go back to the maps of Fars province, I would love to learn more about the province, because so much of my family was core in that province. Right, still have family, in Iran, and even to embark on our own research project to put those cities, those villages on the map, at least, so to speak, on Wikipedia. And that can, if you have a professional topic you're interested in, you can not only, research it for your professional career, but the research you do can be added to Wikipedia, and then it can then feed back to your professional career. So that would be the first answer. The second one, a question about, making it more attractive to beginners. I think the foundation, that's a little bit outside of my area of work here, but the foundation is aware that there can be a bit of a learning curve and it can be a little intimidating. That's why I recommended starting with fixing typos and something similar, just to kind of get in the vibe a bit, get a feel for it. But their foundation is working on making it more user-friendly, and also on, we have the Universal Code of Conduct to ensure that there's, good behavior on the platform, so don't feel so intimidated or frightened. But the foundation is working on it. But I would encourage you to start with simple things, even stuff like uploading photographs to Wikimedia Commons, which then can be used across articles. I did that for a city that I used to live in, and I saw the photos were quite outdated, and that was my very first thing I did was that, upload a few photos, and then I started from there. So hope that answers the question.
That's great. The point that you made about access to academic journals, and that just opening up access to knowledge for so many people, I didn't know that. And I'm sure a lot of people will be very happy to do that, because those journals can often be quite costly. And depending on which country you're in or which institution you're studying at, if you're studying, because obviously learning doesn't stop after you leave university or a higher education institution, I think a lot of people will be very, very happy that you've given that information in terms of that access.
Yeah, I'm just going to post a link to it right now in the chat so that people can take a look at that if they'd like to at some point.
Wonderful.
I thought that was super cool. So sorry.
No, it's absolutely. I'm really surprised to hear that, and I know that a lot of people will be very happy to know that. There was a point made by Mohammed earlier as well. I just like to give him a bit of space. He was talking, I think, about how communities can control their own narrative, just adding to what we were saying.
Yep.
And saying how important it was, he goes, and how governance is actually understood by the community, not just in terms of going up the ranks, but understanding of power dynamics, committee-wise, totally, and board and community-wise, which is
absolutely.
Absolutely. Wonderful. I mean, this kind of takes us on to, and you touched upon this slightly, some people have expressed concerns over the use of Wikipedia as a source of information, given that the content is user-generated. Like, could it lack accuracy? Could there be a lot of opinion from the content creator? And could it actually be edited by anyone? Is there an approval process? You said there's a code of conduct as well. So how does Wikipedia kind of navigate those risks in a user-generated encyclopedia?
Yeah, well, I think it's first, important just to say, I'm also obviously, been an academic, and academic research is always itself has a perspective and a bias. Even the most objective study is you've chosen to study that and not something else. The bias is implicit already, right, in the fact that you've chosen to study X and not Y. So the idea of that, that there won't be something like that, I think we have to be sure to challenge that a bit. That's just a normal part of being alive. I eat something and not the other thing. It doesn't mean I dislike the other thing, but. Yeah, so the community with Wikipedia, this can be a bit of a challenge, but like all fields of knowledge, right? It's an evolving process. It's always growing, and of course there can be some instances where there's like lots of disinformation or misinformation that's out there, but the hope is that yeah, exactly, Mohammed's comment right there is correct. The hope is that the community, simply by having enough people there who have diverse backgrounds and expertise, and also being, openly available to the public to track changes, will be able to sort of, in a way, self-correct over time. And this is why it's important for people to actually view editing Wikipedia as a form of, taking ownership for their knowledge and information, because we can get informed people who can challenge narratives, who might pick up narratives that other people missed. If we speak, for example, on gender issues, let's say heterosexual men editing might miss certain topics that women would want to talk about. That's important. That there becomes really valuable, and it may be unintentional. We want to also be mindful. People sometimes just make honest mistakes, or just don't know. So the communities actually attempt to self-regulate, and informed individuals as well do that. And the foundation, with the Universal Code of Conduct, really tries to encourage that there's civil and respectful behavior, so that kind of questioning and exploring back and forth, has a space to really grow, where people feel a little bit safer to do that.
Yeah, that's great. And you're completely right. Every form of social media or online platform will be the same. There's always risks. There's always disinformation. But as you've explained, the Wikipedia platform, people can almost hold each other to account. If somebody posts something which is clearly incorrect or inaccurate, somebody else could suggest edits and work on that, or fill in the gaps, exactly as you've said.
And the community can help, work through disputes and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the Wikimedia Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know there was a Wikimedia Foundation until obviously we were going to do this talk. So I find this really interesting. I mean, I see that the foundation mission is to empower and engage people around the world to collect and develop educational content in the public domain and disseminate it effectively and globally. What kind of work, what kind of projects does the Wikimedia Foundation do? What do they do to advance this?
Well, Wikimedia, let's see if I can find some of the projects. Wikimedia has an enormous amount of projects that, it's not just Wikipedia, although that's the most famous one. There's, Wikibooks, which is, textbooks and ebooks that are out there. There's a online dictionary, Wiktionary. There's Wikiquote, which actually I really like, which is, you can find specific quotes or add quotes that are from, books and movies and stuff like that you think are particularly resonant. There's one of the best features is Wikimedia Commons, which is this, I think it's like, I don't know, 60, 70, around that million photos and other types of content that are out there that can be freely used, globally. You often will see that in even mainstream news websites and stuff like that there'll be like, copyright, well, not a copyright, but it'll be like, a Creative Commons license for Wikimedia Commons that's there, which is really, really exciting. There's one of the sites I like is Wikivoyage, which is where you edit travel information for travelers. And, sometimes you can find some really cool stuff there. So, the Wikimedia Foundation, and I know it sounds like I'm shilling for the foundation, if you will, or pushing it, but I just think it's really cool. And it really kind of taps into some of the best of the Wikimedia Foundation, the best of the early internet, if you will. And so the foundation is really, working on a number of sort of directions to help facilitate that. And I can only speak really to sort of my experience. One of the first is the Universal Code of Conduct to ensure that we have these spaces that these platforms can actually grow. People feel safe. People from diverse backgrounds feel safe. We have a, human rights policy that is being rolled out right now, and, other work on human rights at the foundation to be sure that people who work in do editing in regime, in states where there might be a risk of their editing, they have some support from the foundation. So there's a number of initiatives to make it safer on the back end for them, in addition to, updates to our mobile look and, and changes to the editing interface to make it more user-friendly and so on. And also, events like this where we can talk with people who might be interested and share more about how this works, because there's sometimes a little bit of a confusion. I've even seen with my own students. Like I've heard students say, "Oh, I didn't know anyone could edit Wikipedia, but anybody can just sign up and do it." You can even do it anonymously. You can even just do it in your IP address will be recorded, but you can just make a quick edit if you want.
That's great. So are there any opportunities offered by the foundation or by Wikipedia itself to encourage people to use this as a tool? I think you've mentioned before in one of our chats an editathon to try and fill in some gaps. Is there anything you could tell us about that?
Yeah, so of course, first of all, the way the Wikimedia movement works, which is the foundation, I think I see it as part of this bigger movement towards free knowledge. Different communities and like, for example, the Arabic community can host their own events to encourage, editathons around topic X. So an editathon is when individuals might come together, face to face or virtually, and edit on either a general theme, a very specific topic, and you come together and kind of work together, really collaborative, kind of a really exciting experience. If you're interested, if you're like a knowledge geek like I am, like I used to lose hours reading the CD-ROM encyclopedia when I was a teenager that came with a computer. So Wikipedia was awesome when that happened. But so these editathons where people can come together and edit, that can be organized by the language communities, right? But there's also sort of thematic communities like LGBTQ user groups that might organize their own editathons. And then the foundation, can provide support for these events, to incentivize and support the community initiatives. The foundation is really here to support what individuals and these communities do. So the events, in a way, we often tend to look at, what can the foundation do? But it's also important to look at the language communities and see what they can do and how can the foundation support that. So it can actually be a little bit more creative, because if the foundation only came up with stuff, that would be very limited by the foundation experience. If, for example, if we're creating an event in Arabic, it's much better to have people who are from the region or speak Arabic or have ties to the region to do it, rather than English speakers in San Francisco. So yeah, but there's a lot of, on the back end, logistical support, grants, research projects that academics can participate in with the foundation, with our research department, to really support this kind of stuff.
That's great. This might be quite difficult, as obviously this is so user generated and it's done on an individual level with people editing the content. But do you know of any examples where people have managed to really successfully create content for their own history, something where there was a gap or something where there was a lot of information not so accessible before?
Yeah, the example that resonates most with me, is the amount of content that was put online about women in Afghanistan, and the way that that history, which had been so, deliberately erased and obfuscated, and even under the previous regime before the Taliban, and now, of course, under the Taliban, that was still oppressed and hidden. How activists around the world were ensuring, that women's history in Afghanistan was not going to be erased, no matter what might happen on the ground, and that Middle Eastern women and non-Middle Eastern women around the world could see that this history existed, and what the Taliban and other groups who were trying to suppress that were trying to say was not the whole story, right? And that, to me, is one of the most inspiring examples, and it shows how important it is, because I've heard it even in my classes, because I teach on human rights, and even before I was working at Wikimedia Foundation, I remember one student talking about, we were talking about Afghanistan, and they mentioned an article that they read about a women's rights activist in Afghanistan from Wikipedia, and it had somebody not taken the time to do that, how was that student who was not from the region going to know that? Who didn't have any interest in the region to know that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's and also not just from the Taliban. It's often growing up in the West with Western media, that was the only image coming to us about Afghani women,
right?
Often about Arab women, Middle Eastern women,
exactly,
Iranian women. It's the kind of it's kind of coming from all sides. So it is really crucial that people can take that into their own hands and put their stories out there directly, or the stories of their family's history, or the history of their village, or local people that they know but nobody outside would have access to. I mean, there's a lot of talk about decolonizing knowledge and decolonizing the access to knowledge and our histories and how they're told. Do you think that people could do that through content creation on Wikipedia or anywhere in the Wikimedia Foundation, any of the platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% think that can be the case. As you said, rightly so. That the narrative around the broader Middle East and all its diversity, is so much often comes from an intentional or unintentional, sort of Orientalist lens, right? Just whatever that might look like. And I'm a big believer in the local communities, and diaspora really getting involved in editing and being sure that content is out there. When you type in a topic in Wikipedia, in Google, the first link that almost 90% of the time comes up is Wikipedia. That's real estate that people who want to decolonize knowledge are abandoning, the first hit on Google, and so many activists don't even think about Wikipedia. Like, boy, that's great. That's enormous, potent territory for having more equitable knowledge, right? So I absolutely think that it contributes to that, and how and it's not only just the first link from Google. It's then you're really engaging in the global conversation. As I said at the very, very beginning, everybody's social media feed is different, but everybody's linguistic Wikipedia pages are pretty much, we see basically the same page, right? So that then becomes sort of a foundation for a conversation, for research article, for discussion, whatever it is. So if we want to decolonize knowledge, right, it happens through these individual conversations, these individual discussions. It's always person to person. And the extent to which then we can actually put that knowledge there from these communities, we can start to change the narrative and conversation. And then a second layer is to get out of this sort of, we've got to appeal to English Wikipedia. I think it's great. I love English Wikipedia. No issue with it. But I have often wondered, like, as I said earlier, are Farsi Wikipedians and Arabic Wikipedians who share so much shared history, going back thousands of years, are those two groups talking? I don't know. What about the Pashto speakers? What about Turkish speakers speaking of the broader Middle East? What about more isolated languages, right? Or groups or communities? Well, I would love, like let's say the Druze, right? Small group. What's their presence on Wikipedia? Like, so even the mindset has to change to not only like say we have to go up to get to the big dog, English Wikipedia, but can we work, because decolonizing is not about hierarchy so much, right? It's about horizontalism, right? It's about like working across these different linguistic and geographic communities. And that's a humongous place of activism that I think would be wonderful as a real way to have knowledge move back and forth within, the broader Middle East, and, however you define the Middle East, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure people who are voluntarily editing content and uploading content, I'm sure there's people with amazing language skills who could actually translate those different pages from Arabic to English, or from Farsi to English, or from Kurdish to English. So there's so many possibilities and potential opportunities. Does the Wikimedia Foundation encourage that, or is it a kind of campaign that you guys could possibly get going at some point? Because it's one of the things that's the first I've heard of it. I'd never thought of that,
It's a great question. As at Human Rights here, we're starting to look at the year 2 of the program, and this is something that I would really plan to talk with people at the foundation about. It's like, how can we encourage this sort of like lateral movement, if we will, around this, and what can the foundation do? And are things like that happen? There's lots of communities out there across the Wikimedia Foundation, the whole world, but absolutely. So and the fact that there's research grants already there's already community grants. If communities want to take the initiative on their own, the foundation has got their back, for that kind of work. Absolutely.
We have a question from Mohammed. He asks, how can the Wikimedia Foundation promote human rights among communities where there is a bias to consider human rights among what Wikipedia is not on their language site?
I'm not exactly sure I understand the question.
Yeah. Maybe Mohammed, maybe you could clarify that?
Could clarify would be
in the comments.
And while Mohammed is doing that, I can just, take it back a bit to what we were talking about. It's also valuable, many of us might have older parents or grandparents who are bilingual, but who are not on Wikipedia. And they could help, participate. Hey, print up the article, show it to them. Can you translate this for me? And start, or even show them, how to do it in a simple way, to also broaden the age gap too, because it, within these communities, which is quite important.
Yeah. You mentioned before that the Wikimedia Foundation was working on a human rights policy. So this is there a new emphasis on human rights? Is this a recent change? And what kind of things would that policy look to put in place?
Yeah, so as Wikimedia has had a goal for a little while to actually to become more global, right? And I'm going to pull up the page about the human rights policy here that we can I can post in the chat so that people can take a look at here. And it's relatively so. As the foundation, you know, a lot of organizations say that they want to go global, but then the problem with going global is that means you're global. That means you're dealing with all the different regions and countries' issues, right? And I think a lot of organizations, they don't want that. They only want the easy part of going global. But you know, if we're going global, that means we have to deal with the fact, you know, that you know what is legal in France, let's say, is different than what's legal in Iran or in Syria. You know, that's just reality. So the foundation, you know, and I really admire them for that, has you know understood that this has to be addressed. I mean, we cannot be global backbone for knowledge, really, you know, unless we're starting to deal with the fact that that people in different contexts have faced different issues using Wikipedia, editing Wikipedia, and so on. So the foundation has, over the past almost about a year and a half or so, you know, really committed to making sure that human rights is part of what the foundation, you know, the work that goes on in the foundation, that our work, you know, is in line with human rights, guidelines, and that we're actively, you know, we've conducted a human rights impact assessment, which we'll be publishing a bit later this year, that we have a policy towards our projects and our communities and our internal work with regards to human rights, so that we can, you know, be prepared and to support the community, you know, in their work around the world, and also to ensure that we are a global actor, not a Western actor which says it's global, but a truly global actor, you know, in line with our global community that's already global, just to be clear.
Yeah, thank you. We actually got some clarification from Mohammed.
Oh, super.
He says that on the Wikipedia sites, there are sections which explain what Wikipedia is not. For example, it is not a news source. He says that one of the is nots on the Arabic site is that Wikipedia is not democratic.
Right. So I will have to go back to this original. So how can Wikimedia, so then if I understand the question correctly, how can Wikimedia Foundation promote human rights among communities where they might say, for example, it is not democratic? So that's a great question, right? And this is where we would really need the community. You know, Wikimedia is still comparatively, for the amount of, you know, traffic and volume it has, you know, a small organization compared to, I think Facebook, you know, just one team at Facebook, one bigger unit at Facebook has like 40,000 employees, right? So the scale is just enormously different. So this is an example where precisely like having the community, you know, reach out and connect with us, connect with our human rights team. If they like, we have an email address. I'll just put it here in the chat, talktohumanrights@wikimedia.org. You know, we can surface some of these concerns, and then either we can work with it or that we can connect with the right people. And, you know, sort of, yeah, exactly. I agree with Mohammed's comment right there. You know, there are very good people at Facebook doing human rights work. I do want to really acknowledge it. Excellent people, really inspiring. But the bigger corporate aims of the organization, of course, it has different aims. But yeah, so having the community, you know, really connect with us, that's really helpful, because some of these we might miss, you know, where there's few people. So exactly what Mohammed's talking about, how can the foundation do that? It's like, well, the first thing is to really let us know. We might catch some stuff, but we don't. We're all in it. I think if you work at the Wikimedia Foundation, you really believe in it. So we're all kind of in it together, if that makes sense.
We have about 15 minutes left of the session. And if anybody has any questions, please do post them in the chat box as we continue talking. Yeah, okay. We've spoken about this quite a lot throughout the session, throughout the workshop. But are there any ways that we've missed on how people can use Wikipedia to contribute to their own narratives? Is there anything that we've missed? Or is there any important content management policies that people should be aware of going forward, especially for activists and maybe content creators, maybe in Palestine and beyond? Any examples you could give?
Yeah, I think, one of the things I think is important, a lot of people have a lot of knowledge about many different things. And, one thing I think is really, really great is if when we have people who even can contribute like a sentence or two about something in their country, Like I went on this very interesting binge of going through reading about castles, ancient ruins of castles in across Iran, right? Some of these entries were one sentence, but that gives you a real sense of richness of the country and a diversity of the country that is different than the narratives you might see. And it doesn't have to be a massive research article where you spent 6 hours, or a weekend, but even like a sentence or two, with, of course, the correct references. And that even these micro narratives, I think they give a lot more texture to the country, a lot more texture to the people and the reality. Sometimes you'll find a Wikipedia article about a small language that's spoken in a Middle Eastern country that's spoken in a few villages, or a dialect, or I found out about fascinating, just for a few sentences, micro dialects that exist, in the city where my family was from. Which was really enriching because it gave me a better texture for how my father and grandfather and grandmother's lives were. So I think that's one way, is also to not is to do these small contributions like that about the small things you might know. I would say that's a really important point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you do associate Wikipedia with these massive long articles and that you have to be an expert in the topic. But
It's overwhelming.
Absolutely overwhelming. And I think exactly as you said, everyone has so much to offer. Could be their own history, could be their own family history. It could be details or stories or histories that not many people would know about, but getting it out there and just contributing in some way is crucial. It's crucial for helping people and helping people in the diaspora as well, as we touched upon before, kind of understanding where they came from, as well as helping people in the countries themselves whose current regimes or governments might have tried to erase in terms of histories, as we mentioned before, with the Taliban and the use and the role of women in society in Afghanistan.
Exactly. And I would also add, with that, like we've talked a lot about language, but also, and we've talked a lot about like sort of, this horizontal movement. But, how great is it to even, share, if you are bilingual, with a smaller language? Like, I lived in Hungary for many years, right? That's a language that's not spoken by a lot of people, right? But even being able, if you have a connection to a smaller language, that's even not in your region, that contributes to the diffusion of knowledge, and that it contributes to, for example, closeness between like Hungarian speakers and Arabic speakers, where there might be misunderstanding or even lack of understanding between these two cultures. So also thinking, not just in my region and not just like English or French or German or these kind of languages that have a lot of speakers, or, Chinese or, these sort of, languages, a lot of speakers, but also smaller languages or ways to build other bridges that might be, quite unique. So thinking creatively about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we touched upon it slightly, but is there any, for people going forward, for activists or for people who just generally care about human rights when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to digital activism and solidarity, talking about the platforms which the Wikimedia Foundation covers, are there any policies that they should be aware of? Is there anything that could affect them when it comes to this or uploading material?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I'm glad we're talking about it briefly. I think one of the first thing is, and this is regardless of where you are, is I don't think it's such a good idea to put your real name on your Wikipedia profile. You never know whether it's the government watching you or just basic identity theft or somebody who's being a jerk and harassing you. I don't think it's a good idea. And I'm keeping the things not tied is probably a safer approach to do. And I think that's one of the first things that people need to be mindful of, and also to be understand that sometimes when we cross cultures in the Wikimedia community, some cultures might not realize that it's simply using Wikipedia or editing Wikipedia in another country can be really dangerous. So having a bit of understanding, and also understanding when people might think that because it's not their experience, from countries where this might be a risk, some basic human empathy. And also, to be mindful of when, if you're uploading content, if you're uploading photos, for example, to Wikimedia Commons, is any information, are there photographs of individuals there that don't want to be there or are unaware that they're there because you don't know. Like, let's say you were a tourist, and you went out and you took some pictures in a country. Perhaps you were engaging in an activity that might be illegal. Like, let's say, some conservative countries, let's say you were out drinking heavily. And then you post at the comments as an example of local culture, right? And there's people's faces in that, and that could have a consequence for them. So being mindful of the kind of content, the kind of photographs, for example, you're uploading, and to understand, to be sure you have permission and understand whether or not that's okay. So just a basic consideration, mindful of your own security, your username, your real name, or not linking it back and forth. What kind of things are you uploading, or being mindful too that editing certain pages, in certain countries, might also be, potentially risky. It's probably not super risky to edit, a page about the certain bugs that live in the country, but editing certain politicians could, put you at risk. And to be mindful, of that, that's possible. That just because it's Wikipedia and encyclopedia and you are taking a neutral stance doesn't mean someone else sees it as neutral, particularly somebody in power.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this question. If you know, you'd even be allowed, but has Wikipedia, have people ever faced pressure from governments over certain content or to remove certain content?
Unfortunately, some of our community members have, and throughout the history of Wikimedia, come under pressure from governments because some governments don't like the idea of free knowledge. I mean, we're banned in some countries, precisely for that reason. So that is the case, and that's why I do talk about some of this stuff here with all of you, because some governments might not see Wikipedia as harmless as we do, as we think it is, or might not be so inclined towards neutrality or research as we would like them to be. So it's just it does happen. It can happen, and I think people should be aware of that as well. And that shows you also how important a project like this is. If people are getting really upset about it, I mean, it's obviously striking a nerve. As we all know in life, the things that make us most upset are usually the places we need to do the most work. So if this is striking a nerve, this is probably important.
Yeah. I just wanted to draw attention that Cameron has actually posted the email address, talktohumanrights@wikimedia.org, in the chat box if anybody wanted to contact the foundation to talk about certain projects or get more information about research grants, so on and so forth. We have a few minutes left, so if anybody wants to ask any questions quickly before we end the session, please do post them in the chat box as soon as you can. Other than that, is there any final thoughts or any kind of final tips and advice that you would like to give people before we finish the session?
Great. I think that this is, first of all, I want to thank you all for having me here. I think it's really great to be here and be part of this forum and this, broader conversation. And I really think that this is a very important way for people to understand the importance of Wikipedia. And I do want to share a quick, there's a little bit of an editing FAQ. I'm going to post a link right here for people who are curious to contribute a bit. You can take a look also at this page which can walk you through how to edit it on Wikipedia for people who are interested in joining. And I really hope that, people in the Arabic-speaking and broader Middle East, communities will see the importance of ensuring that we're talking to each other, with others, and how that is information activism is activism, especially in countries where the voice is oppressed or hidden or has been hijacked by other actors around the world. So I really hope to see many of you editing safely, of course.
Yes, safely.
Yeah.
We did get a question asking you to suggest some resources on how people could contribute to Wikipedia, which you've just done actually, which is great. If anybody wants access to those, they are also in the chat box along with the email address that Cameron provided a little bit earlier. Other than that, I think I just wanted to say a big thank you to Cameron because like I said at the beginning of the workshop, it is the first page that we look at without even thinking. It's not something that we think about in our everyday lives. It is even though we often scroll down to the references if we wanted to, which are also so useful and so important. It is something that it is often our main source, especially if we need just information really quickly. And it is a way of spreading our own narratives, and it's definitely something that I'm going to go away and think about in terms of my own family history, given that there's so little out there, and given the frustration that I felt living in an English-speaking country and wanting to just having this massive thirst for knowledge and wanting to know more. And thank you so much for all the information that you've given. I'm sure everyone enjoyed this as much as I did. And it was a pleasure having you.
It was really a pleasure, Zaina, and a pleasure to be here. And I really hope it was an interesting and valuable experience for everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Be well and take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.